Today we're joined by Congressman Jack Kingston of Georgia, a familiar face in American politics who served over 2 decades in the U.S. House. Jack's known for his wit, his straight talk, and his ability to connect with folks from Savannah, Georgia to Washington, D.C. Congressman Kingston brings not only political experience, but also a human touch to the conversation, and we're excited to hear his reflections on public service, family, and always with Jack, a little of the lighter side of life in politics. So, Jack, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate it very much, and it's so good to see you again.
Tim, it's great to be with you. That was a very generous introduction. I can give you more time if you want to keep on the flattery.
Congressman, you have spent over 2 decades building bridges in Washington, D.C. Now, your son Jim is stepping onto the same path. Feels to me like the Kingston name is becoming a family tradition of public service, which is admirable. But I have this question. How do you feel, given the way politics are today, the rough and tumble, the special meanness, I think that's even worse than when you and I went in back in Congress in '92. How do you feel about him following in your footsteps?
Sending the lamb to the wolves. He's got to grow up. We're going to see if the nepotism play works. But, Tim, like you, had a good family, raised my kids while I was in public service, and had 4 children. I think 3 of them probably are neutral at best. Some probably don't even like politics at all, but one has decided that it might be the life for him. I'm very proud of him. He's working his tail off. And, when you think about it, he grew up going to parades, being drug out to town meetings and ribbon cuttings and things like that. And, I think it was the same way with me. My mother was the chairwoman of the Clark County, Georgia Republican Party. And on those days when she could not get a babysitter, I went there, and she'd give me a box of crowns or something and stick me in the back of the room. And sometimes I was not too disruptive and probably listened. And I think the same has happened to my son, Jim. I think, somehow through the noise, he heard something that he liked. And so I think it would just be wonderful if he's successful in this run.
Well, I hear only good things. Now, going back, though, you mentioned your mom. What was it that attracted you to politics? Was it just that you grew up in the midst of it, and there was something that drew you to it?
Well, this sounds like a corny story, but it is true. I had an older sister who said to me one day, we're sitting at the table. I was probably 10 years old. And she said, "All right, let's see who knows the most people. You get out a piece of paper, and I'll get out a piece of paper." In fact, she handed it to me and said, "You write down everybody you know, and they can't be a family member or a neighbor." And she beat the heck out of me. She knew a lot more people than I did, but somehow it really struck me that, okay, knowing people is a good thing. And that's what the fun of politics is you get to know so many people from so many different walks of lives, each one being a fabric of this great country called America. And, you just sort of fall in love with meeting new people and seeing new people. And so that's part of it. But then the ideological passion, the outrage of not liking something that, maybe oppressive government law that psychologically was a mean teacher that you did not get along with over the years. And you wanted to challenge the status quo in the system. And I think that's where maybe growing up in the South, you just have a little bit of innate rebel in you that just doesn't go away. And you want to push back on Washington, D.C., or maybe somebody just from out of town telling you they know better than you do.
Well, you were we used to have, as you recall, in the House, and they still do it, I guess, the 1-minute speeches where no matter how junior you are, if you get up there and sit on the front row, you can have your 1 minute to say anything you want. I always thought you were the master of that. I don't know how many ended up on the evening news, but there were a lot of them.
Well, it was almost like, trying out a new riff if you were a guitar player. You just say, okay, let me see how this sounds. And so you could give a 1 minute speech. And sometimes you're right. The news did pick up on it because back in those ancient days when you and I were new members of Congress, that social media wasn't there. And so the only chance of getting a repeat on it was if the evening news thought you said something clever. And so, you always wanted to do that. And I know one time Rush Limbaugh picked up on a statement of mine, and that was political karma. I mean, it was the best thing in the world.
Yeah, I remember they were before us. What were they called? The Boehner and Jim Nussel and that gang that.
Ain't seven.
Yes, and I remember it was before I got there, but I heard a lot about it. Nussel put a paper bag over his head during one of his 1 minutes. He only did it for just a brief second, but it ended up on the evening news. That's what he became known for. We did kind of all have that ambition to get clever enough to get on the news. So when we came in '92, before the 2 years before the big contract with America class that was for the first time in 40 years Republicans took control, in '92 we had a pretty sizable class. We were kind of the forerunners of that takeover class, but it was a big class, big Republican class. Many went on to serve in this. Some of them went on to serve in the Senate and other places of greater distinction than the Senate. I know you kind of look down on the Senate, but that freshman class, there was a thing started called Cracker Jacks. And lest it be lost to history, recount, if you can, how that came about and what its purpose was.
Well, I think particularly back in those days, the orientation was marginal at best. And so you sort of have a bond with your freshman fellow members. And we had a number of us who kept talking to each other, over and over again. And we noticed that there were free Cracker Jacks in the back of the room. And we would often go to the Cracker Jack area and we'd grab a box and start talking. So we became known as the Cracker Jacks. But, getting to know guys like you are now Finance Committee Chairman Mike Crapo, or, Jim Talent, who you serve with in the Senate.
Right.
We had an opportunity to be open with each other, ask each other all the dumb questions we needed to have answers to about, hey, how do you get to the bathroom? But the other part of it is, what are we going to do about the national debt? And what about military spending? And so it was friendship, fellowship, but substantive as well.
Yeah, I remember some of those sessions occurred in the evening, and I think you brought the Cracker Jacks, so you get blamed for the name. But there's some great memories. Peter King, there were some colorful people in our class, but one of the goals that we had was to have a representative among leadership. I don't know if you remember that, but our representative, we got somebody to be able to sit at the table with the leadership of our caucus, and we elected Mike Crapo to do that, and who did an admirable job for us. But I think we learned a lot in those early days, and probably had an outsized voice because we semi-organized.
I think we did. And I think the other thing is that we were a new brand of politician because back then Republicans had been in the minority for 40 years. And Bob Michael, World War II hero who landed at Normandy Beach, absolute perfect gentleman. But, as our leader, I think he had gotten used to being in the minority and used to marginal wins. And then, we had people like Dick Armey and Newt Gingrich and Bill Paxton and John Boehner really pushing us as a huge freshman class to, hey, stand up, be loud, vote no, raise Cain, be a little rambunctious, which many of us were. You may even remember that Bob Michael was quoted in the roll call newspaper saying, we've got a great freshman class, but there's only 7 of them who are thoughtful. And he was not referring to you or me.
I remember that quote very, very well. And you're right. It was a new breed. And we were viewed as, along with that 94 class, and those 92, 94, I think in many ways blended together and crossed over.
Yeah.
But we were viewed as revolutionaries, as because we actually believed we could take control of the House. But by comparing it to today, even as partisan as we were, I think it's mild compared to the hyper partisanship that we see in the Congress today. Do you agree?
I do agree with that. I do want to go back to one thing that on the contract with America that was enormously successful. It was a very significant policy package with 10 separate pieces of legislation, but in those legislation, there were like 70 sub pieces of it. So it was really big. But when we introduced it, which was just about a week before the 1994 election, some of our own members would not sign it. They would not come to the press conference, and it was considered pie in the sky and even radical. And yet, most of it did become law in one form or the other. But I think what we always tried to do is lead with policy. And I'd say the newer generation is a little bit more leading with maybe outlandishness because they have to, because this is the way it is right now. They have to chase clickbait, and they have to get likes on Facebooks and Twitter and so forth, and reposts and so forth. And the only way you can do that is to say something wilder and crazier than the next guy, because it's very hard in that very narrow, limited number of words to say something that's going to change policy or change the direction of national security. And so they have to do it differently than we do. And I'm sorry for them because they can't get into the depths of, here's how I would really solve healthcare, because people have less tolerance. The audience just, hey, if you can't tell me in 30 seconds, I don't want to hear about your healthcare plan.
I think that is very insightful. The contract with America, it allowed many of us as junior members, we were junior members then, to be involved in serious policy debates, which became reality when we took control. I think particularly of welfare reform. I was involved in that, so I would think of that. But I think that was one of the great accomplishments of the Republican majority. We did it with divided government, and Bill Clinton as president, who, vetoed, and eventually signed because the people agreed with what we were doing.
And I think it led to his infamous statement in the Statement of the Union, where he said the era of big government is over. Now, unfortunately, that did not last. I wish Joe Biden would have heard that and written it down. But, one of the things I think both of us have learned about government, it's like tending your garden. You can't just weed once and you're finished. You have to continuously weed and weed out the bad policy and plant the good policy. And that's one of the lessons that I learned in my 30-year legislative career. I was 22 in the U.S. House and 8 years in the state legislature. But I realize it's like, again, tending a garden or physical fitness. You got to do it every day if you're committed to it.
Well, absolutely. And I think an example of that was we were able to balance the budget with Bill Clinton and the Republican Congress. It wasn't easy, but that was the last time the budget of the country the books have been balanced. And but if it's not tended, as you said, you lose those policy victories and slide back into the big tax and spend ways that characterize government and still does. So go ahead.
We did have that feeling that we had to get things done. I do think people have lower expectations of Congress now than they did then. But, we could not come home and continue and have these continuous resolutions on the budget. We had to pass appropriation bills. We had to pass a budget. You talk about balancing the budget. I don't think Congress has successfully even passed an aspirational budget for 20 or 30 years. It's really sad.
Oh, it's very, very sad. Now, let me. What I try to focus on in the podcast is the personal side of politics, and I'm wondering, as you look back over those 22 years in the House side, what kind of special friendships were formed? Are there some more than others that you just that's a very special bond that you have? And were there any across the aisle where you found somebody that you may not agreed with them on a lot of things, but you liked them and you were able to work with them? Are there any examples of those?
Yes, and I would say that one. I asked Bob Dole. Bob Dole, as you know, was a presidential candidate. He was a vice presidential candidate. He was the majority leader of the U.S. Senate. He'd been in the minority. He'd been in the majority. He'd been in the House. He'd been in the Senate. You could not have a better career. And I said, well, what was the number one legislation that you passed? And he said, and he was talking to a number of us, and he said, it's really not about the legislation. It's about, did you help somebody? And the people who don't have business cards, don't know lawyers or doctors personally, they often come to you because you are the helper of last resort. And if you can solve their problem, that's what you need to focus on. And I really took that to heart. And I think you were the same way, servant-centered leadership, where hey, listen, I'm not necessarily going to change the congressional soup to steak, but I'm going to make sure my ingredient in this soup is a very, very good one. And I think that's where the great reward is. And there were so many smaller cases like that don't make the news, but you
Right.
helped somebody. And the friendships, you and I have now been friends for over 3 decades, and hopefully we're going to have another 3, and the friendship's going to grow and grow. Same with your brother, same with other people. Across the aisle, Rosa DeLauro, probably one of the most liberal members of Congress, she and I swapped gavels on 2 different appropriations subcommittee. And I'm telling you, we don't agree on anything philosophically. But what we would do is we would say, okay, here's where we're going to disagree: guns, abortion, whatever kind of thing. Here's where we're going to agree, and then here's where we have to debate and figure things out. And when we would try to have this no surprise clause going into it. And, so then 3 months later, I could say, now, Rosa, as you remember, when we sat down, this was one of those areas we agreed to disagree or agreed to argue about. Now comes the argument. And what we found, Tim, is, as you have these 1 hour, 2 hour hearings, and most members come in, they ask their questions, and then they leave. But the chair and the ranking member have to continue to stay there for the entire hearing. And what we found out is when the Democrats and the Republicans left us alone with the witnesses, we found all kinds of areas in which we agreed. Same with Sam Farr. Sam Farr from California, liberal Democrat, represents Monterey Bay. He needed some help with a project once, and I helped him with it. When I was the chairman, they ended up naming a building after him out there at ARS building, Ag Research Center. And he asked me to be one of the keynote speakers, along with Leon Panetta and the liberal Democrat Speaker of the California House. We're up there on dais. And I'll tell you another thing about Sam. He actually, when I went out to California, hosted a fundraiser for me. He said, now, I'm not going to be there, but I'm going to line up some Republican support for you. And, but as you know, you can develop those friendships, but you have to look under the hood of the car and really get to know the person.
Absolutely. If you can get to know someone, grow trust, respect them, and talk to one another and listen, things can get done across the aisle. It still happens, but boy, I think it's a lot rarer than it once was. I served with Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy, polar opposites, but they found areas they could work together, and there are a lot of examples like that. I think in the Senate, it's maybe even more frequent. Even Senator Inouye and Ted Stevens were the best of buddies, and
Yes.
They had great respect for one another, and even the leadership would talk to each other in those days. I think an awful lot of that is lacking today. All right, we talked a little bit about some of your experiences while in Congress. What about the campaign trail? I mean, you've gone through a lot of campaigns. Some easy, some tough, some win, some lose. But do you have any very memorable campaign story you can share today?
I think a lot of it is just kind of getting out and talking to people and shaking people. I'll say this one time, there's this real influential guy in Statesboro, Georgia, and his name was Deal, Deal. And happens there's like 200 Deal families in Statesboro, Georgia. So I'm starting out and I'm the city slicker from Savannah. And this guy's rural. He's not even in Statesboro, he's in Bullitt County in a rural area. And so he agreed to see me, which would have been a huge coup to get Mr. Dill on my team. So I drove to Bullitt County, and it's about an hour outside of Savannah, knock on his door and said, Mr. Dill, I'm Jack Kingston, running for Congress. We talked on the phone and wanted to, come by and talk to you. And he said, well, come on in, son. And sat down there. He said, now, Ma and I are about to eat fish. So would you like fish? I said, yes, sir. So we sat there and ate fish. About halfway through, I realized I was at the wrong deal. He had no idea who I was. and and I think, and he knew from the beginning I was lost, but he was too polite to say anything about it. But, we sat there. I got some great fish out of it and ended up supporting me. He was not the target, but it was still great.
That's a fabulous story, and it says an awful lot about the salt of the earth people that we represented. You sure had them in Georgia, good people, and they wouldn't insult you. They'd invite you in and give you some catfish or whatever. So if you were you probably have given this advice because you've got a son going running for Congress. What would be your advice to some young person today, male or female, that's thinking about politics? Would you encourage it as a noble endeavor, or would you say, boy, that's a rough life, and I'd sure think long and hard about it?
Well, I'd probably do both. I'd say absolutely it's a very noble endeavor, but it's a very tough life. You are separated from your friends, separated from your family. A lot of people, hate the fact that Congress is getting paid one nickel, but they haven't had a pay raise since 2009. And so for a lot of people, it's going to be a financial sacrifice owning two homes, particularly when one of them's in Washington, D.C. But I always point out the book of Proverbs says, build your flock before you build your home. And I'll ask young people, what do you think that means? And they get it. It says, it means build your business, make sure you have financial footing, and then build your luxury, your home. And that's what I say. You need to get a skill before you go into Congress, because Congress is a short-term lease. It may last, as you and I had nice long careers, but some members are there for two years and 4 years. And don't throw away everything for that opportunity, because at one time it's going to end, and you need to have a skill that you can fall back on. And so, and I think also you and I've seen a lot of our friends get in trouble trying to take a shortcut on something, and maybe for financial gain. And if you are financially secure or confident that you can do something else, you're not going to take those shortcuts, and you're not going to be impressed by the big city.
That is a great advice, but on both points. What do you most want to be remembered for?
I think that I served honorably, came home, did not forget who I was or what I was representing. I did a lot of, we had military installations. I did a heck of a lot for Fort Stewart, Hunter, and Moody Air Force Base, making sure that the troops were well trained. And I would always say, as a member of the Defense Appropriations Committee, and it was a trick question, I'd say to school kids, do you want our military to fight a fair fight? And the further away from a military base, kids would raise their hand. But the children of the soldiers would not raise their hand. They knew it was a trick question, because we want our soldiers to have the best equipment, the fastest airplanes and the strongest tanks and everything else. And so working with the military, something I did for farmers, we had a really bad drought one year. And yet, as a rule, Georgia gets a lot of rain. And I asked, well, why aren't we capturing the surface water and from the creeks and the rain and so forth? And farmers told me, well, we can't get ponds permitted. And as you know, EPA and Corps of Engineers can be a real pain in the neck when it comes to permitting. So what I did as an appropriation member is I put money in the budget for pond building. And that accelerated the permitting, because the government was paying for part of the pond. And we built a lot of ponds, and at one time they were actually called Kingston ponds. But the idea was it was going to
I
save money.
like that. That's pretty good.
Well, and it was going to save money for droughts, which it did, because it helped farmers with good water supply. But things like that don't go in history books. Georgia was a huge tobacco state. I helped them transition to blueberries, and it's a big thing, big product now in the first district of Georgia.
Well, we love that, but we missed the cigars.
Well, let me tell you, I got my supply, and there's nothing as rewarding as sitting around a campfire with a cigar. But I want to tell you one other story that's just, you want to say when somebody asks that question that I did something really great and significant. But one of the things that you and I both got to do is get the awards and the medals for the old World War II soldiers who were, leaving us. They were in the twilight years, and their grandchildren said, "Daddy, what did you do in the war? And did you get a medal for it?" And what, I found, and I know you did, is so many of those guys were 22 years old. They'd seen the worst war in the history of the world. They didn't want their medal. They just wanted to go back home to Arkansas or Georgia, wherever. But I got to get the medals for a guy who was in the Bataan Death March, and another one who landed on Normandy Beach, and actually dozens of others. And they would always say to me, "Just give it to me." And "Oh, no, I'm not going to do that." I'd call their families, and I'd call their grandchildren, and we'd plan a speech and a ceremony. And it was so important, I think, to the family, but also to the community to see it. And the press was great about covering it. And one guy drove a trash collecting truck in Baxley, Georgia. Now, I mean, he picked up limbs and branches on the roadside, probably made $10 an hour. We found out, and he was the guy who'd been at Normandy Beach. We put so many medals on him that he had to lean to put him on the cover. And the guy had never said anything to anybody about it. But, usually these guys never would come to me. It was a family member or a friend.
That's a great legacy. That's the kind of thing that may not go in the history books, but when you're able to help people and recognize people. So, Jack, thank you. As we wrap up today, I want to thank you for sharing some personal stories and showing us the personal side of politics. It's not just about votes and bills. It's about people and families and communities that we serve. So I want to wish you and your family, and especially Jim, the best of wishes as he embarks on this great journey. And thank you again for being with us.
Tim, thank you. I really thank you for your friendship, and I'm glad you're doing this podcast, and I appreciate being part of it.
Thanks. God bless you.